I came home for my grandmother's funeral, but what waited for me wasn't grief. It was a rusty box. Inside, a shaky handwritten note. Your mother didn't die from gas. It was arranged. I read it over and over, my throat tightening. Then it hit me. My father, the man crying through the eulogy, was the one who killed her. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to follow every shocking episode we release next. It had been 7 years since I last stepped foot onto the Hartman estate. The gravel crunching under my boots felt foreign now, like stepping into a theater set I no longer belonged to. My name is Ivy Hartman. I was once the granddaughter who used to pick lilies beside the greenhouse with bare feet and sticky hands. Now I was just the estranged architect summoned back to witness the end of a matriarch who once called me her North Star. The sky hung heavy that morning, gray like dusted velvet. Rows of white chairs had been arranged with cold precision on the lawn in front of the old chapel. I recognized most of the faces, cousins who hadn't sent a single text in years, uncles who forgot I existed unless someone died, and Victor. My father stood near the casket like a polished statue, his hands clasped behind his back, chin high, eyes void. He wore grief like he wore his tailored suits, expensive, stiff, and entirely for show. Clarissa, his wife, and my former stepmother stood beside him in a sleek black dress that felt more like a runway statement than mourning. Then there was Mason. He stepped out from a black town car like a ghost from the past. My half-brother, the chosen one, the one who got to leave and live and return when it was convenient. We hadn't spoken since he moved to London 5 years ago. His hair was shorter, his jaw sharper, but the smugness still sat perfectly on his lips. He nodded at me across the crowd like we were at a business conference, not our grandmother's funeral. I didn't nod back. The service began with organ music that was too loud, too sterile. An unfamiliar reverend recited a generic eulogy, mispronouncing Evelyn's middle name twice. No one corrected him. My chest tightened. Then Victor stepped forward to deliver the family's farewell. My mother, he began, pausing just long enough for the cameras to focus, was a woman of grace, dignity, and unwavering discipline. I felt bile rise in my throat. She taught us, myself, and later my children, the value of structure, tradition, and loyalty to one's name. Loyalty to one's name. As if Evelyn hadn't once told me to never let our last name define who I was. Victor glanced my way just briefly, and I knew the next words were for me. She believed in legacy, and she believed that legacy must be preserved by those who understand responsibility. There it was, the backhanded eulogy. He continued droning on about values he never lived, devotion he never gave her in her final years, and the great burden of continuing her work. People nodded along as if he were reciting scripture. My fists clenched in my lap. When the final hymn ended and guests began to scatter toward the reception tent, Victor cleared his throat, loudly. Before everyone departs, he announced, lifting a crystal glass filled with some too expensive bourbon, I'd like to share something the family should know. Clarissa's lips curled into a neutral smile. Mason crossed his arms. I stood still, every nerve in my spine sharpening. In accordance with the legal arrangements my mother left prior to her passing, he said with the practiced cadence of a boardroom dictator, the Hartman estate, including its assets, holdings, and the stewardship of Evelyn's charitable foundation, will be entrusted to Mason Hartman. A murmur swept through the crowd. Mason looked surprised for a half second, then nodded like this was always meant to be. I stood frozen. Victor continued. It is a decision that reflects not only her will, but her vision for the future of this family. Mason, with his business acumen, international experience, and commitment to the Hartman legacy, is the rightful bearer of that vision. He turned to me with a smile so cold it burned. As for Ivy, he said, "Your grandmother left you a personal keepsake. A box of memories, I believe. I trust it will be meaningful to you." Gasps, some polite coughs, a few raised brows, but no one stepped in. No one ever did. I stared at him, then at Mason, then back at the casket. A box. 4 years at an Ivy League architecture program. A lifetime of caring for Evelyn while Victor was off charming oil tycoons and Mason played at being European. A box. The reception carried on as if nothing had happened. Waiters passed around hors d'oeuvres no one touched. Conversations picked up about market trends and boarding schools. I slipped away toward the garden. The air smelled of rain and overgrown lavender. I found the stone bench where Evelyn and I used to sit just beyond the greenhouse, the place she once called her quiet kingdom. I sat. My hands shook, not from surprise, because deep down I had always known this was coming, but from the sting of how blatant it was. They didn't even try to pretend. A shadow fell over me. Mason. He stood beside the bench with his hands in his coat pockets. "I didn't know," he said, voice quiet. "Didn't know you'd be handed everything," I snapped. "Or didn't know I'd get nothing." He flinched, just slightly. I thought there would be something more for you," he said, awkward. "Ivy, I didn't ask for this." "Of course you didn't," I said. "You never have to." He exhaled. "Maybe you should open the box. She probably left you something meaningful." I laughed. "A photograph. A locket. A note saying I was loved from afar while being erased up close." He didn't answer. Just stood there, looking for once like he didn't know which side he was supposed to be on. When I returned to the estate, the box was waiting for me in my old bedroom, now stripped of everything familiar. Just bare walls, a bed, and a sealed mahogany box on the desk with a brass clasp. I opened it. Inside was a small velvet pouch containing an old iron key, rough-worn and unmistakably heavy. Beneath it, a folded sheet of thick paper with a handwritten note in Evelyn's tight cursive. "Don't let loud voices bury deep truths. Some roots grow where eyes refuse to look. E." I stared at the key, and I knew this wasn't a farewell. It was an invitation. I sat on the edge of the bed in the hollowed-out remains of my childhood room. The box Evelyn left me still open on my lap. The velvet pouch, now empty, lay to the side. The key rested in my hand, cold and rusted, with an iron stem that curved slightly at the end. A key to what I didn't know. But it wasn't the key that haunted me. It was the note. Short, handwritten, with a sentence that had the weight of a riddle and the whisper of warning. "Don't let loud voices bury deep truths. Some roots grow where eyes refuse to look. E." I read it again. And again. Her script, neat, angled, deliberate, felt like she had written it with full clarity of what it would ignite. She knew. She had to. And that terrified me. There was nothing else in the box. No will, no fond goodbye, no sentimental keepsake to soften the blow of public humiliation, just that key and a cryptic message. And maybe that was everything. I laid back against the creaking mattress and stared at the cracked ceiling above. In the hallway, the murmurs of guests drifting toward the exit filled the air, muffled like the ending of a show no one wanted to watch to the end. I could leave. I should leave. My bags were still packed. But instead, I closed the box, set it gently on the nightstand, and whispered to no one in particular, "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." The next morning, the sun tried to fight through the gray, but it only managed a faint glow. I pulled on a jacket and wandered the grounds. The estate looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Like someone had moved the walls half an inch overnight. Something was off. The staff, the few who remained, offered polite nods but no eye contact. Clarissa was already gone off to a charity brunch, according to the maid. Victor had barricaded himself in the study, likely polishing his smug speech for the board of Evelyn's foundation. It was Mason I ran into first. He was by the garden, pretending to admire the hydrangeas like he even knew what they were. When he saw me, he gave a tight smile and tucked his hands into his coat. "Morning," he said. I nodded. "Didn't expect you to still be here." "Didn't expect you to be either." We both stood in awkward silence, the kind that builds between siblings raised under the same roof, but in separate realities. He glanced at the box I held in my arms. "Did she leave you anything interesting?" I tilted my head, studying him. A key. A key. I watched his face closely. There was a twitch right at the corner of his mouth. Suppressed surprise. Maybe even fear. I narrowed my eyes. And a note I added. Something about voices and truth and things buried. He looked away, feigning nonchalance. "Sounds like something Grandma would write." She always loved her metaphors. "She also loved secrets," I said quietly. His shoulders stiffened. "Just enough for me to catch it." "Mason," I said, "do you know what this key opens?" He hesitated. Too long. "No," he said finally. "No idea." Lie. It wasn't the words that betrayed him, it was the way he said them. Soft. Slippery. Like they were spoken with gloves on. I took a step closer. "You're a bad liar." He laughed, but it didn't touch his eyes. "That's not true. I'm an excellent liar. You just know where to look." I held up the key between us, letting the morning light catch on the rust. "She wanted me to find something. She trusted me, not Victor, not you, so if you know what this is, say it." He stared at the key, and for a split second I saw something crumble behind his gaze. Not guilt, not even fear. Regret. "I don't know exactly," he said slowly, "but I know she had things hidden. Papers, stuff about Dad, stuff she never wanted him to find. She kept saying the truth had a shelf life. And you didn't think to tell me? I didn't know if you'd care." That stung more than I expected. "She was your grandmother too," I said. "Yeah, but she didn't look at me the way she looked at you." "And what way was that? Like I hadn't disappointed her yet." Silence. I dropped my eyes to the key again. The metal left a faint rust stain on my fingertips. "I think it's for the greenhouse," I said. He blinked. "The greenhouse. You remember the old cellar beneath it?" Mason scoffed. "That place was sealed years ago. We weren't allowed down there." "Exactly," I said, "because Evelyn didn't want Victor anywhere near it." He paused. "You think she hid something down there?" "I think she left me a key for a reason." He rubbed his chin, processing. "And if you find something, what then? You think you can overturn the inheritance? Humiliate Dad?" I shook my head. "It's not about that." "Then what?" "It's about knowing the truth. The kind that no longer fits in a box." He looked away again, and for the first time since he arrived, Mason looked younger, smaller, like the boy who used to sneak candy under the dinner table and whisper secrets to my dog. That boy I had loved, trusted. Now I wasn't sure what remained. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for," he said, voice suddenly thin. I turned to leave the key clenched tight in my palm. But before I took more than 3 steps, I heard him say one last thing. "Be careful, Ivy." I didn't look back. Later that evening, I returned to the greenhouse. It was exactly as I remembered, overgrown, warm breathing, with the scent of rotting orchids and wild rosemary. The door creaked on rusted hinges, but the path beneath the vines was still there, still waiting. I knelt near the northeast corner, brushing away leaves and soil until I found the outline of the cellar door. The iron latch was rusted shut, but the key fit imperfectly, but it fit. With a groan of metal and a jolt in my chest, I turned the key. Something shifted beneath the earth, and I knew this wasn't just a box Evelyn left behind. It was a beginning. The afternoon hung low and slow over the estate like wet cotton. I wandered without purpose. At least, that's what I told myself. But my feet had memory, and they knew exactly where they were going long before I admitted it. Every step through the overgrown paths of the Hartman estate peeled back a layer I thought I'd buried years ago. The swing set was still there, half rusted, its chains sagging like tired arms. The pond near the East Grove was choked with algae, no longer the crystal-clear mirror I used to skip stones across. And beyond the hedges, nestled against a slope of ivy-choked stone, was the old greenhouse. I stood there staring at it. That glass dome was where I spent countless hours as a child, barefoot and dirt-streaked, trailing after Evelyn as she whispered the names of flowers like lullabies, phalaenopsis, vanda, cymbidium. Orchids were her favorite. She used to say they bloomed when they felt safe, that they had to be tricked into thinking they weren't alone. Funny, I'd forgotten that part. But even stronger than the memory of Evelyn was the one that lived in shadow, the one I avoided, the day everything changed. I was 16. The fire alarm had gone off in the middle of the night, piercing the silence like a blade. Smoke in the hallways, screams, flashing lights. My mother's bedroom sealed behind flames and the smell of gas. They told me later it was a leak. Faulty heater. A tragic accident. But it never felt like an accident. Evelyn didn't cry at the funeral. She held my hand in the limousine and said, "The dead whisper, Ivy. You just have to listen without fear." I didn't know what she meant. Not then. But now, standing in front of the greenhouse with Evelyn gone and a key burning a hole in my pocket, I wasn't afraid anymore. I stepped inside. The air was damp and musty thick with the scent of rotting leaves and earth. Light poured through cracked glass in fractured beams. Vines crawled along the inner walls like veins. Most of the orchids had withered to husks, but one bloomed in defiance, a pink moth orchid, tall and stubborn. At the back beneath the old bench Evelyn used to sit on, I knelt. The soil was loose here, not fresh but unsettled. I dug with my hands, scraping past damp moss and brittle roots until my fingers hit iron, a rectangular outline, heavy, cold, a hatch. I brushed the rest of the dirt away. An old padlock clung to the latch, rusted to the point of being almost ornamental but still sealed. My breath caught. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the key from Evelyn's box, and held it over the lock. It fit. Not just in size. It belonged. The kind of fit that felt like a handshake from the past. But the metal resisted. The teeth of the key caught but wouldn't turn. Rust crusted the edges. Years of neglect had fused lock and latch together like bone calcifying over time. I sat back on my heels, palms filthy chest tight. So close, and yet, not today, I muttered. I stared at the lock, trying to think. The greenhouse had always had a workbench. Tools, supplies, somewhere. I stood brushed off my knees and turned toward the northwest corner where Evelyn kept everything neatly organized. Time hadn't been kind. The drawers were swollen with moisture. Half-rotted paper packets, spilled open fertilizer seeds, notebooks scribbled with Evelyn's gardening codes. But beneath the mess in the third drawer down, I found what I needed: an old bottle of industrial-grade rust remover, a wire brush, and a battered cloth. I carried it all back to the hatch like a ritual. Each stroke of the wire brush carved a path through the rust, revealing the blackened mouth of the keyhole. I poured the solution slowly, watching it hiss and bubble like the ground was alive. The smell was metallic and sharp. I waited. While it soaked, I sat against the wall and looked around. How many secrets had this place kept? How many of them were growing in the dark under my feet? Evelyn had guarded this greenhouse like a vault, never letting Victor in, never explaining why some parts were off limits. As a child, I thought she was just being old and stubborn. Now I realized she was protecting something. Maybe me. Maybe she had known all along that one day I would come back, and that I'd need to unearth something buried deeper than roots. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the note again. Don't let loud voices bury deep truths. Some roots grow where eyes refuse to look. Was she talking about the past, about my mother, about Victor, or all of it? A sudden thought clawed its way into my mind, ugly uninvited. What if the fire that killed my mother wasn't an accident? I had asked the question once when I was 17. Evelyn had looked me in the eye and said, "Someday you'll find what you're looking for, but not when you're still bleeding." I hadn't understood. I thought she was avoiding the truth. Now I wondered if she'd been giving me permission to wait, to heal, and then to dig. I stood and tried the key again. It still didn't turn. Frustrated, I kicked the hatch. The echo rang through the greenhouse like a challenge. I dropped to my knees and began scrubbing again, this time with urgency. I wanted to see. I needed to know, because something lived down there. And whatever it was, Evelyn had locked it away with intention. Not to keep it hidden from the world, but from them. From Victor, from the family who built their names on inheritance, image, and silence. As I scrubbed, a memory came back. I was 11, sitting at this very bench while Evelyn told me stories about flowers that bloomed once every decade. She said the most powerful things grew slowly, quietly, out of sight, until they couldn't be ignored. That memory broke something open in me, a fracture, and through it resolve poured in. I wouldn't leave, not until I opened this hatch, not until I knew the truth beneath this earth, not until Evelyn's whispers had names. The padlock, now half-eaten by the remover, looked weaker. I tried the key again, still tight, but this time there was a click. Not enough to open it, but enough to promise it would. I sat back, filthy shaking but smiling. Something was waking beneath this estate, and it wasn't done speaking. The dining room looked like something out of a curated magazine spread, crystal glasses, flickering candles, cutlery aligned like soldiers. Everything glimmered, shimmered, sparkled, except the people. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, the farthest seat from Victor. He liked it that way. Control needed distance. His glass of wine stayed full the entire meal, untouched like a prop. Clarissa sat beside him in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my first semester of college. Mason across from me focused on his lamb, cutting it into symmetrical pieces without once looking up. Dinner had been quiet for the first 10 minutes, the kind of quiet that screams beneath your skin. Victor was the first to speak, of course. "So, Ivy," he said casually, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Still dabbling in your little buildings?" My fork froze midair. "Architecture," I said. "I'm a licensed architect, not a hobbyist." "Right?" he said, tone dipped in honey and poison. "Designing museums no one visits, I assume. Very artistic. Not particularly lucrative, but charming." Clarissa chuckled softly. Mason kept chewing. I swallowed the bite in my mouth, resisting the urge to launch my water glass across the table. "You know," Victor continued, tilting his head, "your grandmother used to say that business was about instinct and numbers, not emotion. But you were always emotional. Passionate, yes, but volatile." Volatile. It rolled off his tongue with the same weight as ungrateful. I breathed deeply. My knuckles whitened beneath the linen napkin in my lap. "She didn't write that in any letter I saw," I said. His eyes narrowed. Clarissa leaned in with her practiced, placid smile. "Victor, darling, don't be harsh. Ivy's just different. Creative. Sensitive. That's not a flaw." "You're right," he said, swirling his wine. "It's a liability." Mason said nothing. Not a glance. Not a sound. Just the metallic click of fork against plate. Victor continued, voice silk and acid. "You never understood legacy, Ivy. That's why you didn't get the estate." Evelyn saw it. She was sharp, brutally honest sometimes. She knew who had the mind to lead, and who he paused slicing into his meat was better off dreaming. There it was, the sentence Evelyn warned me about. "He controls everything through fear, not through love." That phrase from her letter rattled in my mind like a lock being turned. This wasn't dinner, it was a performance. and Victor had always been the director. I watched him raise his glass, so satisfied, so certain. The patriarch, the strategist, the man who never noticed he was already being watched. The wine shimmered. The candlelight flickered. The room so full of surface perfection had never felt more rotten. I placed my napkin on the table, slow and deliberate. "Excuse me," I said. No one objected. That would have required real emotion. As I stood, I caught Mason's eyes for a second. He looked away. Coward. I left the room without a sound, crossing the marble floors with a calm I didn't feel. My heels echoed like a countdown. The hallways narrowed as I moved past portraits of dead Hartmans, all glaring down with the same expression, pride wrapped in ice. The greenhouse door creaked as I pushed it open. The cold hit me first, then the smell of damp soil and decay. I dropped to my knees in front of the hatch. The rust-stained key was already in my pocket. I didn't hesitate this time. I pulled it out, wiped it clean against my coat, and shoved it into the lock. It turned. With a groan of old hinges and the muffled protest of decades, the padlock fell open. I gripped the iron handle and pulled. The hatch gave way slowly, like something exhaling for the first time in years. Dust billowed. A scent rose up, mold earth, something older than memory. I stared into the darkness, then climbed down. The narrow ladder groaned under my weight. The walls were stone-damp, cracked, breathing cold against my skin. I descended slowly, each step a reminder Evelyn built this for hiding, not comfort. At the bottom was a concrete floor, uneven and half covered in moss. A single bulb hung from the ceiling on a cord. I pulled it. Light bloomed weak and yellow, but enough to see the filing cabinets, 3 of them lined against the back wall. Beside them, a wooden chest half-rotted, and shelves of boxes labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. Personal. Victor. Miriam. Miriam, my mother. I walked to the chest, my heart thudding in my ears. Inside were photographs, letters, documents. My fingers trembled as I picked up one folder. The first page was a report gas line inspection. Redacted signatures, warnings, underlined in red, deliberate tampering suspected. I closed my eyes. She knew. Evelyn knew my mother's death hadn't been an accident. And Victor, he was listed as the last one seen leaving that wing of the house, an unofficial maintenance check logged with no formal request. I flipped the page. Another report, this time from the family lawyer, Evelyn's original will. It named me the full beneficiary of the estate with Victor removed as trustee. Date 3 years ago. The revised will, the one Victor presented at the funeral, was dated more recently. Typed, sanitized, notarized, but by one of his company's legal staff. My grandmother had tried to cut him out. He'd buried it. Just like he buried her voice beneath his. My breath shook. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about justice. I stepped back, holding the folder to my chest, heart pounding. The air in the room pressed in. The walls felt alive with memory, with the weight of Evelyn's final act. She hadn't trusted the courts. She'd trusted me, and I wasn't going to let her down. Upstairs, laughter echoed faintly from the dining room. Victor probably making another joke at my expense. Clarissa likely sipping from her wine glass, her makeup untouched, her smile weaponized. But they didn't know what I knew now. They didn't know what was coming. I looked at the hatch above me, the light from the greenhouse spilling in like a holy wound. "Let's dig deeper then," I whispered, and began pulling open the second drawer. The hatch closed above me with a low thud, muffling the world I had just left. I stood still for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light of the single bulb swaying above. Down here, the air tasted like old stone and secrets. It pressed against my skin like wet velvet, and every sound, every breath, every movement felt too loud. I moved slowly toward the far end of the cellar, my boots brushing dust and forgotten time. The wooden chest was heavier than it looked, wide enough to store more than just family photographs. Its edges were worn smooth from hands that had touched it decades ago, Evelyn's hands, I imagined. The lock was old but already pried loose by time and rust. I opened the lid carefully. Inside, bundled in twine and time, lay a stack of thick manila envelopes, some yellowed at the corners, some sealed with wax. Beneath them, a hard-bound ledger, and lying on top of everything else, a letter. Handwritten. My name on the front. I stared at it for a moment longer than I should have. My name in her script felt more intimate than a whisper. I unfolded it. Ivy. If you're reading this, it means you've found the place I never let anyone else see. That means you listened. That means you saw through the silence. I swallowed hard. I don't have time to write it all. I've written the rest in files, documents that speak louder than I ever could. But I need to say this to you myself, one last time. Your mother didn't die in an accident. And it wasn't fate. It was planned. I believe it. I saw the signs too late to stop it, too afraid to confront it, but not too late to leave the truth behind. Forgive me for what I couldn't do when I was alive, but you, my fierce, brilliant girl, you can. The paper shook in my hands. My mouth was dry. I read the letter again and again until the words blurred into static. My mother, all these years. The silence. The avoidance. The looks I'd caught Evelyn giving Victor when he thought no one was watching. And now confirmation. It wasn't just suspicion. It wasn't just grief trying to assign blame. It was real. I placed the letter aside like it might break. My fingers were numb as I reached for the envelopes beneath. The first was labeled Hartman Estate, Original Will. I slid it open. Inside was a handwritten will, notarized dated almost 4 years ago. In it, Evelyn left the entire estate property's shares in Hartman Holdings, the charitable foundation, to me. Every line was direct, clear, explicit. Mason and Victor were mentioned, but only to be excluded due to persistent behavior counter to the values this family was founded upon. There was no ambiguity. This was her true final wish. Which meant the document Victor had read at the funeral was not only a fraud, it was a complete erasure of everything Evelyn believed in. My heart pounded. The second envelope was fatter. It contained spreadsheets, legal correspondence letters between Victor and a firm named Cargill and Weeks. I didn't recognize the name, but the logo, sleek, minimal, soulless, belonged to one of Victor's many shell firms. I read each page, eyes darting faster with each line. Asset transfers. Undisclosed holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. Property sold under false pretenses and repurchased under dummy entities. Fund siphoning from the Hartman Foundation. 10 years of manipulation. And Evelyn had documented it all. She'd even highlighted specific payments traced back to the month before my mother died. Installations of faulty gas lines, orders made in Victor's name, then scrubbed from public records. I couldn't breathe. I sank to the floor, clutching the folder like it might keep me upright. The bulb above me swayed slightly, casting long, soft-moving shadows against the stone walls. My mother had always been quiet, gentle, the kind of woman who made a home with her laughter and calmed storms with her voice. I remembered her humming in the greenhouse, teaching me how to prune orchids. I remembered her hugs, tight, full of breath and intention. She'd been the kind of person people underestimated. And maybe that's why Victor hated her. He couldn't control her softness. He couldn't dominate her the way he did business employees' image. So he erased her. And no one stopped him. Not until Evelyn. I leaned against the chest and let the tears come slow, silent, not dramatic. Just the kind that spill out because they've waited too long to fall. When the last one slid down my cheek, I wiped it away and stood up. No more waiting. No more silence. I packed the files into a messenger bag I found on one of the lower shelves. I took the letter, the will, the financials, every page I could carry. Then I reached for the ledger, a thick leather-bound journal. I didn't have time to read it now, but something told me it was important. Evelyn had pressed a dried orchid into the first page. Her last signature was scrawled in ink. I turned off the light and climbed back up into the greenhouse. The air felt different, lighter. Or maybe that was me newly heavy with knowledge and intention. Outside, the night had fallen. The estate looked quiet, windows glowing like watchful eyes. I slipped through the shadows, avoiding the front doors, walking the long way around to the guest house Evelyn used to keep for friends, now empty, dusty, forgotten. I locked the door behind me and set the bag on the bed. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Mr. Harris," I said when the old voice answered. "It's Ivy. I have something you need to see." Silence. "Then how bad is it?" "Worse than we thought," he exhaled. "Then I'll see you in the morning." I ended the call and looked around the dark room lit only by the orange lamp on the nightstand. My hands trembled, still covered in dirt. But my heart was steady. The truth was no longer underground. It was walking, and it had my name. The law office smelled like old leather and buried intentions. It sat tucked behind a row of antique shops in the oldest part of town, far from the modern towers and glass-fronted firms where Victor now conducted most of his business. This place was Evelyn's choice, quaint, unassuming, and discreet. She once told me that real work happens where no one is watching. Now I understood. I climbed the narrow staircase, every step creaking beneath me, and paused outside the frosted glass door labeled Harris and Gray Attorneys at Law. The lettering had faded just like everything Evelyn once built with dignity and silence. Inside the office was dimly lit. The receptionist's desk was empty. A slow jazz record crackled softly from an old player in the corner. Behind the glass door of the inner room, I saw him, Harris. His back was turned, hunched slightly as he organized papers into a leather folio. He turned when I knocked lightly, his face lined with time and secrets. "Ivy," he said, not surprised. "I wondered when you'd come." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. I found it. He didn't ask what. He simply motioned to the seat across from his desk. I sat, dropping the worn messenger bag onto the floor beside me. The silence between us carried weight. History, truths long stifled. "Where?" he finally asked. "Under the greenhouse," I replied. "She built a vault under the old orchid room. She left everything, documents, the original will records of Victor's theft, and a letter." His jaw tightened. "She always feared he'd destroy everything, that he'd find a way to overwrite her with legal muscle and polished lies. She tried to outmaneuver him." "She did more than try," I said. "She succeeded." He nodded once slowly. "I knew about the vault. I just didn't know she gave the key to you." "She didn't trust anyone else," I said, meeting his gaze. "Should she have?" He looked down. "And that's when the truth began to pour out. Evelyn came to me 3 years ago," Harris said. "She had just finalized the new will. She told me she no longer believed Victor would carry out her wishes, personal or financial. She asked me to file the new documents quietly away from Hartman Holdings' legal department. I agreed. I stored a copy. But then he found out." My hands clenched in my lap. How she trusted one person too many. A clerk. Someone on payroll with split loyalties. Within weeks, Victor showed up in this office, calm, smiling. He asked about updates to Evelyn's estate plans. I said nothing. But that night, Harris paused, rubbed his temples. My car was vandalized. My wife's medical records were hacked and posted on an anonymous forum. It was a warning. Days later, Victor called and told me very clearly that I could retire early and quietly, or not at all. "You didn't go to the authorities?" I asked. His eyes met mine, hollow and tired. "And tell them what?" "That a grieving son used veiled threats to coerce a lawyer into silence, that he was too clean, too rich, too connected to touch. Evelyn told me to lie low, to wait. She said you'd come when it was time." I leaned back in the chair, my body heavy with all the pieces falling into place. He destroyed her voice, I whispered. No, Harris said. He delayed it. But he didn't erase it. You have the documents. I pulled the bag up onto my lap and unzipped it. Slowly, I laid the original will onto his desk. Then the files, the records of theft, the emails, the signed contracts, the manipulated holdings. He examined each piece with trembling hands. When he looked up, I saw something return to his face. Resolve. Not strength exactly, but the shape of it. This is enough, he said. More than enough. I want it brought forward, I said. Legally. Quietly. But when the time is right, it all comes down. He nodded. Agreed. But you'll need more than documents, Ivy. You'll need someone inside. I already knew what he meant. Mason! The name sat like a stone between us. He's scared of Victor, I said. He's been groomed to be his echo. But not his equal, Harris replied. That's always been Victor's flaw. He builds mirrors, not minds. And your brother, for all his weaknesses, he has doubt. That's leverage. I thought about the dinner. Mason's silence. His refusal to meet my eyes when Victor mocked me. But also the flickers, the way he froze when I mentioned the key, the edge in his voice when he said Evelyn looked at me differently. There was guilt there. Maybe something deeper. If I couldn't trust him fully, I could at least use the part of him that wanted to stop being afraid. I'll talk to him, I said. Harris leaned forward. You have one shot. If he breaks, Victor will know you're building something. I nodded. As I stood to leave, Harris reached for a folded sheet of paper inside his drawer. She left this for you, too. Told me not to send it unless you showed up with the truth. He handed it to me. I opened it. Just one line in Evelyn's hand. When facing a house of mirrors, find the one who wants out the most. That's where you strike. I left the law office just as the sun broke through the clouds. For the first time in days, the estate behind me didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a battlefield. And Mason Hartman was the soldier who hadn't yet chosen a side. I found Mason where I knew he'd be at the edge of the lake behind the east garden, standing like a statue between the water and the world he'd tried so hard to escape. The sky above was steel gray flat and heavy, like something holding its breath. He didn't turn when I approached, just stood there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the water as if it might reflect a version of him he could live with. You knew I said no introduction, no preamble, just a fact. He exhaled through his nose. I didn't know everything. That's not an answer. He turned finally, and his face looked older than it had the day before, like the weight of the estate had sunk into his skin overnight. Ivy, he said, voice low. Don't start this like I'm the enemy. I'm not sure you're not, I said. I pulled the messenger bag from my shoulder and dropped it onto the wooden bench behind me. The buckles clinked. I opened it, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the folder with the will. Read it, I said, holding it out. He didn't move. Mason. He took it like it burned. His eyes scanned the first few lines. Then his face changed, eyebrows, knit mouth, twitching pulse, flickering at the base of his neck. I've seen this handwriting, he murmured. It's hers. It's dated 3 years before she died, I said, and it names me as the sole heir. He looked up sharply. But at the funeral, what Dad read was a forgery, fabricated through Cargill and Weeks. I have their correspondence. Evelyn knew it might happen. That's why she hid the truth, why she left me the key. He dropped onto the bench like the weight of it all buckled his knees. I knelt in front of him. She trusted you too, I said, or at least, she hoped you'd come around. Mason rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't know about the new will, but I always suspected something was off. The foundation fund's money vanishing, her distance from Dad those last few years. I asked him once, and he said she was losing clarity, that he was helping her set her affairs in order. I scoffed. He was setting her silence in stone. Mason shook his head. I was an idiot. I should have— You were scared, I interrupted. So was Harris. So was Evelyn. So was I. He looked at me surprised. I've been scared for years, I said. Of him, of the silence, of what it means to say something when no one's listening. But that's over. I pulled out the second folder, the one with the financials. I opened it in his lap. "Read that one," I said. Mason skimmed the first page and his expression twisted. Page after page of laundering misappropriation and names his own name attached to accounts he didn't recognize. He looked sick. "He used me," Mason said, voice cracking. "He put my name on these transfers." I nodded. "So when this all comes crashing down, you go down with him. Unless," he snapped his gaze to mine, "unless I do what betray my father." I didn't blink. "Unless you stop betraying yourself." He stood again, pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "You don't get it, Ivy. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to him. He was always measuring me against you, your grades, your grit, your stubbornness. He said I was the face of the legacy, but you were the brain he couldn't control." That terrified him. "He should have been terrified," I said. Mason stopped walking. We stood in silence. The lake behind us still and gray, the wind brushing cold leaves across the stone path. "I'm not asking you to burn him," I said. "I'm asking you to choose the truth." Mason looked down, then slowly looked up. "Tell me what you want." "I want you to help me undo the lie," I said. "To help me bring the original will forward. Quietly. With Harris. I want you to support the transfer of the estate before Dad catches on. And I want you to be there when I confront him." He stared at me, not afraid, not defiant, just tired. "And if I say no, then I walk into that house alone," I said. "And when the dust settles, I'll make sure your name's not on anything salvaged, not even the soil." He took a breath, closed his eyes, then nodded. "He shouldn't be in charge anymore," he said. "He destroyed everything. Evelyn, the company, our mother." The word stopped me. Our mother. He looked up, regret clear in every word. She wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve to disappear. I was 16, Ivy. I didn't understand what I saw, but I remember Dad ordering a repair crew to our wing of the house the week before the gas leak. I asked him why. He told me to stay out of it. My throat tightened. "I think he meant to scare her," Mason said. "Make her feel powerless. Not kill her." But then it happened, and he acted like nothing had gone wrong, just called it a tragedy, and I believed him. I stepped closer. Mason looked hollow, like something had been excavated from his chest. "You can't change the past," I said, "but you can decide how much further it spreads." He nodded again. "I'll help you," he said. "But we do this smart. We time it right, we prepare, and we take him apart piece by piece." Finally, I allowed myself a breath. We weren't allies, not exactly, but we were no longer enemies. The game had shifted, and this time the board was ours. We didn't sleep much after that. Plans born out of trauma tend to keep you awake, pulsing behind your eyelids like a second heartbeat. Mason and I sat at the old dining table in Evelyn's guest house, papers, drives, court forms sprawled between us like a battlefield in blueprint. Step 1, secure the truth. We met with Harris at dawn in his quiet office. He was already waiting, fresh suit, black coffee eyes sharp, like he hadn't aged overnight the way the rest of us had. I handed him the original will. Mason handed him his phone, on it a video recording of our conversation by the lake. Mason's face, his words, his confession. Harris listened, nodding, not blinking once. "This is enough," he said. "I'll file it directly with Judge Morrison's office. She's worked with Evelyn before. She'll take it seriously." "What about the fake will?" I asked. "That's the next step. We'll need a certified forensic examiner to verify the signature inconsistencies. I've already made the call." Mason sat silent, staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them. We knew Victor wouldn't go down easily. He'd spent decades building a fortress of perception, relationships, and threats. But he hadn't built it for war, he built it for display. And display crumbles fast under pressure. Step 2, force him to show his teeth. We drafted invitations to a family legacy evening at the estate under the guise of honoring Evelyn's charitable vision. Elegant, formal, dignified. Exactly the kind of setting Victor couldn't resist. He thrived in performance. This time we would be the directors. Clarissa RSVP'd immediately, of course. She likely already envisioned herself making toasts in pearls. The extended relatives followed suit. Mason sent the message to Victor himself. It's what Grandma would have wanted. He responded 2 minutes later with a thumbs-up emoji. Arrogance makes people careless. Step 3 was harder. We needed something beyond the will. A nail in the coffin. Proof of manipulation at scale, something financial, traceable, and irrefutable. His laptop, I said. Mason blinked. You've been working with him, I continued. You know where he keeps his drives, his encrypted backups. You get me that hard drive and I'll get someone to crack it. Mason hesitated. He's paranoid. He doesn't leave them out. And the last time I even touched his desk without asking, he made me sit through a 3-hour lecture on digital hygiene. Then don't touch, I said. Steal. He gave me a look that wasn't quite fear, just the ghost of it. Can you do it? I asked. He looked away, jaw flexing. I know where he hides the backups. Behind the liquor cabinet in his private study. Top drawer. Hollowed out copy of The Art of War. Of course. I raised an eyebrow. Fitting. I'll get it tonight, he said. During the board dinner. He always makes me give the opening toast, leaves the room right after to check calls. Gives me 6 minutes. 7 if I pretend to stutter. I smirked. Make it 8. That night, while Victor entertained shareholders in the chandelier-lit ballroom of the estate, Mason walked out mid-toast and did what he never thought he could, stole from his father, not out of rebellion, but out of conscience. He met me back at the greenhouse an hour later, pale and sweating, but victorious. The drive was small, black, smooth, with no markings. I handed it off to the tech specialist Harris had flown in from New York. A quiet woman in her 60s with 3 PhDs in the face of someone who didn't believe in excuses. It's password locked, she said. It's Victor, I replied. Try control. She paused. Typed. Click. Unlocked. Of course, I muttered. She scrolled, clicked, and within minutes her expression shifted from professional detachment to thinly veiled disbelief. There's enough here to make the IRS weep, she said. You've got offshore accounts, illegal tax shelters, doctored board minutes, bribery trails, names of judges, contractors, ghost donors. This isn't just mismanagement, it's criminal enterprise. I looked at Mason. His face was blank. Not shock, not denial, acceptance. Like watching a reflection you always suspected but hoped wasn't real. I turned back to the screen. Can you extract and duplicate everything? Organize by category. Already doing it, she said. We stayed quiet for a moment, the clicking of her keys the only sound. Then I stood, walked to the glass wall of the greenhouse, pressed my forehead to it. Evelyn's orchids had started to bloom again, resilient in spite of the rot that once surrounded them. We have the will, I said. We have the finances, the proof, the witnesses. Now we need a stage, Mason replied. I nodded. He stepped up beside me. You think he knows, he asked. Not yet, I said. But he will. The second we stop playing by his rules. Then let's break them all. And so we did. The invitations went out the next morning. An evening of reflection, honoring the life and legacy of Ivy Hartman. A family event. A celebration. A reckoning. We chose the date carefully, 2 weeks from the night Victor filed the false will. Everything was in motion. Now all we had to do was wait and prepare for the look on his face when the walls finally started to fall. The chandeliers were too bright. They always were in that room. Evelyn once said that Victor had them custom installed with higher wattage bulbs so that no corner of the space could hold a shadow. He doesn't like things that can hide, she'd whispered like it was a punchline wrapped in truth. Now the room glowed like a stage set to burn. The gallery had been repurposed for the night. White linen-covered cocktail tables circled the center, floral arrangements towered in every corner, and a live quartet played something elegant and hollow. On the walls hung curated photographs from Evelyn's life, Her wedding charity events posed portraits with political figures, everyone handpicked by Clarissa, no doubt to reinforce the myth of legacy Victor so desperately clung to. The guest list read like a corporate who's who. Partners from the Hartman Foundation, board members from Hartman Holdings Press from the local business journal, and scattered cousins brought in from both coasts who hadn't said Evelyn's name aloud in 5 years. I arrived fashionably late as planned. My dress was black, sleek, no jewelry, no embellishments, just presents. Victor greeted people like a politician. Smiles, sharp laughter, empty a glass of wine untouched in hand. Clarissa floated beside him, wearing grief like silk, flawless and measured. Mason was already inside, standing near the back, watching everything, every angle. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the lights dimmed slightly. Victor stepped forward. He tapped the microphone twice, and the room stilled. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "My mother, Evelyn Hartman, believed in excellence, in tradition, in the power of family to shape the future. Tonight is not just a remembrance of her life, but a recommitment to her vision." Polite applause followed. Victor soaked in the sound like applause was oxygen. "And now," he said, gesturing to me, "her granddaughter Ivy would like to say a few words." He smiled at me. I didn't smile back. I walked slowly to this podium, heels echoing on marble, folder in hand. The room was silent as I stood, eyes heavy on me. I paused, exhaled, then spoke. My grandmother believed in truth. A ripple passed through the room. My voice was calm, controlled, every syllable weighted. She believed in tradition, yes, and legacy, but not as decoration. She believed those things had to be earned, lived, protected. I looked out at the faces, familiar, rehearsed, expectant. Some of you remember her kindness, others her discipline. She could be fierce, unforgiving, but she was never a coward. And she hated lies. Victor shifted just slightly beside Clarissa. She gave him a look. He didn't return it. She left me something, I continued. Not just words, not just memories. She left me the truth. And she asked me when the time was right to share it. I opened the folder slowly. Please direct your attention to the screen. The projection lit up behind me, a black screen fading into grainy video. Evelyn sat in her garden hair pulled back, wrapped in a shawl, her voice calm but fierce. "If Ivy is playing this," she began, her voice echoing through the gallery, "then it means Victor has done exactly what I feared, and it means you're all owed the truth." Gasps. A few people shifted in their seats. Clarissa's fingers tightened on her wine glass. Victor didn't move. "I rewrote my will 3 years ago," Evelyn continued. "I left the estate to Ivy, because she earned it, because she's the only one I trust to rebuild what this family has let rot. If you are hearing me now, Victor, then you have betrayed me, and everyone else here deserves to know it." Murmurs swept through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Someone whispered my name. Mason stepped forward, still silent, still watching. The video ended. Silence followed. Then Victor laughed, soft at first, then louder. "Well," he said, walking to the front like a man who still believed the house was his. "I always admired my mother's flair for drama." He turned to the crowd. "This is clearly grief talking hers Ivy's. We all process loss differently." I stepped aside, let the moment hang. "Unfortunately," I said, "we're not just dealing with sentiment." I reached into the folder again, pulled out the certified copy of Evelyn's handwritten will, notarized, dated, and signed. I held it up for the cameras. The press had arrived, of course. Mason had ensured that. "This," I said, "is the real will." Gasps again. Victor's voice sharpened. "That will was replaced?" "Forged," I cut in. "We had a forensic handwriting expert analyze the signature on the document you presented. It doesn't match Evelyn's." A man in the crowd, a known journalist, stood. "Are you suggesting legal fraud, Ms. Hartman?" "I'm not suggesting," I said. "I'm confirming." Victor's jaw clenched. "This is nonsense." He turned to Mason, who finally stepped forward. "Mason," Victor said, his voice edged with warning. Tell them. Mason looked at him, then at me, then turned to the crowd. My sister is telling the truth. A single sharp exhale from Clarissa. I saw the evidence, Mason continued. I ignored it at first. I didn't want to believe it. But it's real. The original will, the misappropriated funds, the shell companies. Dad has spent years turning this estate into his personal power bank. Victor's face went red. You ungrateful little... Save it, I said. This isn't a stage you built. You don't control the script anymore. People were standing now murmuring, phones recording. Leave, I told him softly, before the police arrive. Victor didn't move. Then Mason took a step toward him. Don't make this worse, he said. There's still time to walk away with a shred of dignity. Victor's eyes darted across the room. He saw it now, the walls closing in, the narrative shifting without him. He turned, walked out without another word. Clarissa followed, quietly. I turned to the guests. This isn't the end, I said, but it is a beginning. And somewhere, just for a moment, I could almost hear Evelyn's voice. Well done, little fox. Well done. The silence that followed Victor's retreat should have been a curtain fall. But I wasn't finished. The guests hadn't moved, some frozen in place, others whispering nervously, phones still recording. The air inside the gallery had changed thicker, denser, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear the truth. I stepped back toward the podium, the will still in my hand. I understand this is difficult to absorb, I said, voice steady. But it's not just a story, it's a legal reality. Harris, standing near the front, raised his hand. With the court's permission already secured, he said clearly, I can confirm that this is the legally binding version of Evelyn Hartman's final will and testament, witnessed, notarized, and recorded. The document that was previously presented by Mr. Victor Hartman has been proven to be a forgery. There it was, the final nail. Victor, who had paused just beyond the archway, turned back into the room. He was no longer smiling. You little traitor, he growled, voice low but venomous, locking eyes with Mason. You stabbed your own father in the back for what? Her approval, her scraps. Mason didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. I was loyal to you for 28 years, he said, and you never saw me as anything more than a puppet with your last name. Victor scoffed. You're weak, just like your mother. The room gasped. My nails dug into the folder in my hands, but Mason spoke first. No, he said quietly, she was kind and strong, and she never wanted this family to become what you turned it into. Victor's voice rose, cracking at the edges. This is my legacy, I built it. I held it together while you two played in your own fantasies. You mean while you lied, stole, threatened your own children, I said. His eyes snapped to me. You were always the problem. Even as a child, you questioned everything. Thought you were smarter, better. Evelyn poisoned you with her self-righteous garbage. I walked down from the podium, meeting him eye to eye. She didn't poison me. She prepared me. You're nothing without this name, he snarled. I'm everything in spite of it. Victor lunged half-step forward, jaw clenched, face flushed. The room recoiled. Clarissa tried to move toward him, hesitated, then froze. That's when the doors opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, calm and direct. 1 male, 1 female. Their presence was quiet but absolute. Mr. Victor Hartman, the female officer said. He turned stunned. What the hell is this? Harris stepped forward, calm as ever. I called earlier this week. There are charges pending: fraud, will tampering, financial misappropriation. They're here to escort you for questioning. You are not under arrest yet, but resisting cooperation would be unwise. Victor's eyes darted across the room. Every glance found a phone, a stare, a person he couldn't manipulate anymore. He turned to Clarissa. Say something. She stepped back. Victor, she said carefully, you need to stop. His mouth fell open. I didn't marry into this to watch you spiral, she continued. This isn't my mess. You were there when I rewrote the will, he snapped. You helped me. No, she said flatly. I watched. That's all I ever did with you. Watched. Then without another word, she turned and walked out. Her heels clicked down the marble hall like an exclamation point. Victor stood still for a moment. Then he turned to me, voice soft but twisted. "Do you feel powerful now? Turning your family into spectacle." I stepped closer. "I didn't turn this family into anything. I uncovered what it already was." The officers approached. Victor didn't fight. He didn't speak again. He simply looked around the room, and for the first time in my life, I saw what Evelyn must have seen long ago, a man built of performance now watching the stage collapse beneath him. As he was led out, the guests remained silent. Some ashamed, some impressed, all changed. Mason stepped beside me. "That's it," he asked. "It's really done." I shook my head. "No," I said. "It's just beginning." He let out a long breath, not relief exactly, just release. Together, we turned back to the room of witnesses, of doubters now converted. The story wasn't over, but the mask was off. The headlines came fast. Victor Hartman, under investigation for fraud and estate tampering. Family empire collapses from within the heiress who didn't blink. By morning, the story had gone national. A media frenzy circled the estate like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. But this wasn't death, it was reckoning. Ivy Hartman refused all interview requests. I sat on the stone steps of the East Garden, where Evelyn used to drink her morning tea, watching the sun rise over the fields. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like I was trespassing on someone else's legacy. It felt like the house was breathing differently now, lighter but still tired. Victor had been brought in for questioning the night of the confrontation, and though he wasn't arrested on the spot, the investigation opened wide. Harris handed over all necessary documents, the original will, the altered financial records, bank transfers. The forensic team was already tracing money trails and scheduling interviews with former accountants and board members. Clarissa disappeared. No statements, no appearances. Her absence was loud in a way only calculated silence can be. Mason said he doubted she'd ever come back. The state prosecutor's office called me personally. I gave them everything, quietly, without show. No press conference, no revenge speech. Just a brown envelope slid across a table in a locked room. "You understand what this could mean for him?" the prosecutor asked. I nodded. "I'm not asking for prison, I'm asking for consequence." He studied me. "You don't want to press charges yourself?" "No," I said. "That's not my job." Later that day, I passed a cluster of reporters outside the gate, shouting my name, waving microphones like weapons. I didn't stop. But one of them, a woman younger holding a notebook instead of a camera, asked a question that made me pause. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" I turned, just once. "Not everyone deserves forgiveness," I said, "but everyone has to learn accountability." Then I walked on. Inside the estate, change moved slowly but steadily. Mason moved into the West Wing. Not as a new patriarch, not as an entitled heir, but as someone rebuilding brick by brick. He removed Victor's portraits from the hall, cleared out the study. He even burned the decanter cabinet, the one Victor used to lock behind coded drawers. "This place needs new bones," he said as we watched the fire crackle behind the garden shed. "New breath," I added. He looked different now, less polished, more real. He'd started wearing simpler clothes, stopped checking his phone every 3 minutes. His voice had dropped into something calmer, not lighter but steadier. "I keep thinking about all the things I didn't say he told me one afternoon." "You said the ones that mattered," I replied. He nodded, staring out the window at the workers clearing the north gardens. "He still calls me, you know," Mason said. "Victor." "Yeah," leaves voicemails. 3, 4 a day. Mostly threats wrapped in apologies. "You'll regret this, but I love you. I was doing what I had to, but I was always proud of you." Like he's trying to re-edit his legacy in real time. "Let him talk to his own echoes," I said. He smiled weakly. "That's poetic." "It's not poetry," I said. "It's survival." As for me, I kept my room in the guest house, refusing to move back into Evelyn's suite. It didn't feel right. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I spent my time cataloging. Not just paperwork, memory. I walked the halls and whispered her name aloud in places where silence had once been too thick. I opened the trunks she hid in the attic, old diaries, letters to friends she never sent, notes about me and Mason from when we were children. She had written down everything, even the way I laughed when I saw snow for the first time. She had been preparing me all along, preparing us both. And yet the truth came at a cost. Victor's reputation was already falling apart. 2 major business partners announced formal reviews of all Hartman Foundation contracts. His personal fortune froze pending investigation. And while I never wanted to see him destroyed, I also never wanted to see him untouched. Justice for me didn't look like a man behind bars. It looked like a man looking at himself with no more mirrors left to lie through. One morning I found a letter slipped under my door. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. You think you've won, but all you've done is dismantle something that took a lifetime to build. You don't understand what power demands, what it sacrifices. You'll learn, and when you do, you'll remember I was the one who warned you. I didn't respond. I tucked the letter inside Evelyn's old journal between the pages marked orchid notes. I thought it belonged there between life and stubbornness. Mason asked me what I planned to do with the estate. I told him I didn't know yet. Maybe nothing, I said. Maybe something that matters. He raised an eyebrow. That's vague. It's honest. A few days later, I stood in the greenhouse again beneath the rusted hatch that once held all our secrets. The orchid Evelyn had saved was still blooming brighter now. I knelt beside it, fingers in the dirt. Evelyn's voice came back like breath on the back of my neck. Some things grow best when no one's watching. So I watched, silently. Not everything needed an audience. Some justice is personal. And that too has value. It started with a blueprint on the dining room table. Not the glossy kind drawn up by hired firms with pristine portfolios. This one was raw hand-sketched by Mason on tracing paper coffee stains on the corners, lines thick with ambition and hope. He leaned over it like a man relearning his purpose, pointing at a series of connected rooms he labeled Creation Wing Therapy Garden and Open Studio for Silence. I stared at the paper for a long time before saying anything. She would have loved this. She dreamed of this, Mason corrected. She told me once after your mom died that the house had become too quiet for the wrong reasons. She said it needed new voices, not ghosts. We sat in silence, letting that land. By the following week, the press had moved on to fresher scandals. The headlines quieted. The investigations continued quietly in the background, but the cameras stopped flashing outside the gates. And in that rare lull of stillness, we made our move. At the next board meeting of the Evelyn Hartman Foundation, I stood at the head of the room and outlined the plan. The estate is no longer a monument to power, I began. It's becoming a place of transformation, a sanctuary, a center for youth who have been discarded, overlooked, or silenced just like I was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The decision was final and the room knew it. We filed the paperwork within the week. By month's end, the Hartman estate had been rezoned as a private nonprofit initiative. We named it the Lantern House after something Evelyn once told me when I was a child afraid of the dark. If you can't find the light, be the one who carries it. Mason took charge of the architectural redesign. He approached it differently than he ever had a project before, not as a performance, not as a product, but as a gift. I'm designing this for them, he said, but I'm also designing it for her. His sketches turned the west stables into studio spaces, the old carriage house into dormitories. The east garden would become a therapy maze, a winding path through lavender oak and open silence. And the ballroom, stripped of crystal chandeliers and ego, it would become an exhibition space for the children's work. The ones who come here, I told him, they don't need pity. They need canvas. We sold off the unnecessary, the penthouse in Manhattan. The fleet of cars Victor once insisted were investment pieces, the offshore properties Evelyn never signed off on. Every dollar went into the fund. Every dollar mattered. And with each wall we painted, each floor we tore out, the house began to breathe again. We invited local artists and educators to collaborate, painters, sculptors, poets, counselors. Some came for the cause, some came because they'd once been abandoned too. One woman, a former foster youth turned trauma therapist, walked through the estate with tears in her eyes and whispered, "No one ever builds palaces for the forgotten." We did. The first child who arrived was named Leah, 8 years old. Foster placement failed. Her file read nonverbal, high-risk, emotionally unresponsive. Within 3 days, she had drawn a mural on the greenhouse wall, chalk rain falling over a bright yellow door. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. On the 4th day, I found her sitting in Evelyn's old chair by the koi pond, watching the water in complete stillness. She listens to everything the garden caretaker whispered to me, just like Evelyn did. We opened our doors without ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no donors gala. Just a quiet shift from what the house used to mean to what it now stood for. Mason and I walked the property every morning before the children woke. Sometimes we talked about next steps. Sometimes we said nothing at all. One morning, I found him placing a small plaque on the front gate. I leaned closer. The Hartman estate, reimagined by Evelyn's grandchildren, dedicated to those the world tried to forget. He looked at me. "She would have fought us on the font," he said. I smiled. She would have insisted on italics. We laughed for the first time in weeks. Real laughter. Not just the sound of relief, but the feeling of forward motion. The legacy wasn't about marble floors and perfect bloodlines. It was about what you do with what's been broken. We broke the estate open, and something new had begun to grow. It was early spring when Lila found the key. She had been exploring the garden paths behind the greenhouse, her tiny boots leaving soft tracks in the dew-covered grass, pockets stuffed with pebbles and acorns like treasures only she understood. She was 7 thin and watchful, with that quiet kind of presence you only notice once the room stills. She brought the key to me after lunch, holding it in both hands as though it were something fragile and sacred. "I found it in the dirt," she whispered, "by the big glass house. Is it magic?" I blinked my breath, catching for reasons she couldn't know. It was the rusted iron key Evelyn had given me, the one that had opened the cellar beneath the orchids, the one that had unlocked not just a hatch, but a truth buried beneath a legacy of control. I thought I had lost it during the renovations. I remember tossing it into a storage bin, unsure whether to keep it as a symbol or let it go as a weight. Somewhere along the line, it had returned to the soil, like it knew where it belonged. I knelt in front of her and took it gently from her palms. "It's not magic," I said, "but it did open a door that changed everything." Lila tilted her head. "Whose door?" I looked at the key, the way the rust curled around the edge like a story unfinished. "Let me tell you," I said. That night, we sat on the old rug in the reading room, the one Evelyn had imported from Morocco in the 80s, faded now but still full of warmth. The fire crackled low. The smell of lavender tea drifted from the kitchen. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window panes like it too wanted to listen. I told her everything. Not the sanitized version in the brochures. The real version. The version where Evelyn wasn't just a founder, but a woman who carried heartbreak like porcelain in her chest. The version where my mother Miriam had died not from misfortune, but from fear, from control, from silence. I told Lila about Victor not as a monster, but as a man who confused dominance for love and pride for legacy. I told her how Evelyn gave me the key because she knew one day I'd need to dig into the ground, into the lies, into myself. Lila didn't speak much. She just listened with her knees pulled up to her chest, eyes wide and unreadable. When I finished, I said, "The house used to belong to people who believed in appearances. Now it belongs to people who believe in truth." She thought for a long moment, then said, "Can I keep the key?" I smiled. "No, but you can wear it." We took a thin strip of leather and looped it through the ring. She hung it around her neck like a medal. That key became something else after that. Kids began to ask about it, and Lila would tell pieces of the story, bits she remembered, bits she imagined. Sometimes I heard her whisper in the hallway, "It opened the house from the inside." She wasn't wrong. A week later, I went into the east sitting room, Evelyn's favorite room. For years, I had avoided it. It was the room where my mother used to sit with her tea and her sketchbook, where she'd pull me into her lap and say, "Let's watch the fire, pretend to talk." The room had stayed untouched, as if it still belonged to the version of our family we pretended once existed. Until now. I brought in a frame. Inside it was the only photo I had of my mother smiling without apology. She was standing in front of the greenhouse wind in her hair, sunlight flaring behind her like she belonged to something ancient and alive. I placed the photo on the mantel, right where her teacup used to sit. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the moment to stop hurting. When Mason came in, he didn't say anything. He just put a hand on my shoulder, gave it one firm squeeze, and left. That night, I sat on the floor of the room with the fire burning low and the photo above it, and I wrote Evelyn a letter. I told her the house was full again, not of ghosts, but of possibility. I told her Lila had found the key. I told her I forgave her for the things she never said out loud. And I told her I was beginning to forgive myself for surviving, for staying silent, for waiting so long to love this place again. The next morning, Lila passed me in the hallway, the key swinging on her chest. "Do you think the door's still there?" she asked. "It is," I said, "but it doesn't need to be opened again." "Why?" "Because we're already inside." She nodded like she understood more than she should. And maybe she did. Children often do. The lanterns hanging from the edge of the veranda glowed like fireflies suspended in amber. It was just past 8, and the sun had vanished beneath the tree line, leaving a sky still breathing orange. The lawn below was alive with laughter light, unguarded, the kind that lifted and lingered. Children darted between garden beds and stone benches, their joy echoing off the walls of the once silent Hartman estate. Someone had drawn a hopscotch path on the walkway with sidewalk chalk, and it was already half smudged by little feet. Ivy sat on the wooden steps of the porch, legs stretched forward, arms wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The night air was soft, smelling faintly of cut grass and rain that hadn't come yet. Mason lowered himself next to her with a grunt, rubbing his palms together out of habit more than cold. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence between them had shifted, no longer tight or guarded, but open. Familiar. Finally, Ivy broke the quiet. "You ever think," she murmured, "how close we were to never knowing any of it?" Mason exhaled a kind of laugh, escaping. "Every day. If Evelyn hadn't left that key, if you hadn't stayed, if we hadn't looked." They let the what-ifs trail into the night. It wasn't regret, not anymore, just awe at the narrow path they'd walked, the exact moments that could have broken differently and left everything buried. Left them buried. "I think about that cellar," Mason said quietly. "How long it sat under us. Years. Locked and waiting." Ivy smiled wryly. "Isn't that what we were, locked and waiting?" He looked at her, brow furrowed, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe we still are. Just less so." A squeal of delight erupted from the yard. Lila had found a flashlight and was shining it against the side of the house, making shadow animals with another boy. A bat, a horse, a dragon. Mason tilted his head toward them. "They don't carry it. The weight, the blood. That's the point, right?" Ivy followed his gaze, her voice steady. "That's the hope." She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. The one with worn leather corners and Evelyn's initials pressed faintly into the spine. She hadn't opened it in weeks, not since the renovation finished, not since she told Lila the story. Now, under the wash of porch light, she turned to the very last page. The handwriting was smaller there, as though Evelyn's hand had trembled or her thoughts had quickened. "The first key opens truth," Ivy read it aloud softly. "But truth alone can shatter. The second key is forgiveness. Don't forget it." She closed the notebook slowly. Mason didn't speak. He just sat there letting the sentence settle between them like dust in the air. "I don't know if I've forgiven him," Ivy admitted after a while. "Victor, I don't think I can." Mason rubbed his jaw. "You don't have to. That's not what she meant." "What did she mean then?" He looked down at the grass. "Maybe not about forgiving him. Maybe it's about forgiving the parts of yourself you gave away to him." Ivy didn't reply, but something in her shoulders loosened, barely perceptible, like an old rope finally giving in to gravity. They sat like that for a while, two people who had been broken and mended by the same house, the same blood, the same fire. A breeze moved through the wind chimes, sending a low ripple of sound across the porch. Below them, the last of the children began to wander inside, ushered by the soft calls of volunteers and kitchen staff. Lights flicked on in the windows. The Hartman estate, once a fortress of manipulation and silence, now breathed like a home. Ivy Mason said, not looking at her. "Do you ever wish it had all stayed buried?" She didn't hesitate. "No, I wish we had dug sooner." He smiled faintly. "Me too." Another silence. Then Ivy rose slowly to her feet, stretching her arms, the notebook still clutched in one hand. She looked out at the garden one more time. The lavender patch Evelyn had planted decades ago was in bloom again. She and Mason had cleared the weeds themselves just 2 months back. Ivy turned to him. "You staying the night?" "Yeah," he said, standing. "Guest room upstairs." She nodded. "I'm heading to bed. Big day tomorrow. Another interview, another permit. Art Wing's expanding." He gave her a thumbs up, already half turning toward the door. But before he stepped inside, he paused. "You know," he said, glancing back, "for a long time I thought I was the lucky one. Getting the inheritance, the house, the name." "You thought wrong," Ivy replied, smiling softly. He laughed under his breath. "Yeah. Turns out the real inheritance was the mess." "No," Ivy said. "The real inheritance was the chance to fix it." And then she disappeared into the house, the notebook pressed to her chest. Evelyn's final words echoing not just in her ears, but in the very walls of the place they'd rebuilt. Forgiveness is the second key, and tonight at long last they had begun to turn it. The morning broke clear and bright, like even the weather understood what the day meant. Rows of chairs had been carefully arranged across the once lonely lawn of the Hartman estate. Now it was no longer a manor clinging to ghosts, but a living, breathing center reborn under a new name carved in cedar above the main entrance, the Evelyn House for Hope and Arts. Banners hung between trees reading "Healing Through Creation" in bold, welcoming script. Children roamed the garden in carefully chosen outfits, white shirts with brushstroke-colored handprints across the back, each handprint their own. Guests trickled in, local government officials, donors, community members, and journalists with cameras already rolling. Volunteers handed out programs. Every page carried the photo of a woman who never got to see this day, Evelyn Hartman, smiling behind a cascade of orchids. Inside the hall, Ivy stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting a pin on her lapel. It wasn't a flower. It wasn't jewelry. It was the same rusted key, polished now, framed in clear resin and worn like a quiet badge of origin. Mason appeared behind her, fixing his collar. "They're ready." Ivy turned, her voice soft but steady. "So are we." Outside, as the crowd quieted, Ivy took the stage. A hush fell the way it always does when truth is about to be spoken. She looked out, not at the cameras, not at the dignitaries in the front row, but at the children sitting on rugs near the steps, their faces open, unbroken, the ones Evelyn always said the world forgot first. Ivy began. "There's something my grandmother used to say," she said, "that not all things buried are meant to stay hidden. Some need to grow." She paused, her eyes scanning the space between her and the past. This house was built to impress. Then it became a place to control. Today we open it not to remember power, but to rewrite what family means. The wind stirred the trees. She let the silence carry. "I didn't come from a perfect home. Some of you didn't either. But the truth is, None of us get to choose where we start. What we can choose is what we build from there. Cameras clicked. Mason watched from the side, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable until it softened, until his jaw eased and his eyes shone. Ivy smiled at the children. We use the word family like it's earned by blood, but I've learned it's something we create, something we fight for, something we offer. She stepped down from the podium and walked to the front row. A little girl, Lila, stood up and reached for her hand. Without hesitation, Ivy pulled her forward. This is my family now. The girl grinned, and others began standing too, joining her. A boy in a wheelchair rolled up beside them. A teenager in a paint-splattered apron followed, arms crossed but curious. Then Mason stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply put a hand on Ivy's shoulder. And in that gesture, the story that had started with betrayal, with silence, with a house full of locked doors, ended in something open, something warm. One of the reporters asked for a photo. Everyone turned toward the lens. The children stood in front, Ivy and Mason behind them. And for the first time in decades, the front lawn of the Hartman estate held something worth remembering. Not power, not scandal, but a new kind of legacy. As the shutter snapped, Ivy whispered to no one and everyone, "This time we choose the ending." And behind her, the old manor stood tall, not as a symbol of the past, but as a home for the future. The courtroom was nearly empty when the sentence was read. Victor Hartman stood rigid, chin high, as if dignity could shield him now. The judge's words were calm practice, 2 years of probation, financial penalties in the 7-figure range, permanent disbarment from managing any trust or estate. Victor didn't flinch, but Clarissa did. She hadn't spoken to him since the night of the confrontation. She sat in the back row, dressed in gray fingers, tapping an envelope. It was her divorce petition, neatly signed. She didn't hand it to him in the room. She didn't even look his way. She passed it to his lawyer, instead turned and walked out of his life without a word. No tears, no rage, just quiet erasure. Outside the courthouse, Ivy declined all interviews. Mason stood beside her, answering what he could. But the press wasn't the point anymore. The real story had already been told inside a manor reborn and in the hearts of children who didn't need headlines to feel safe. Days later, under a soft, overcast sky, Ivy stood at the front gallery of the Evelyn house. She was holding something small encased in glass. The old key, still rusted around the edges, still worn from time and hands that clutched it too tightly. But now it sat mounted on walnut wood engraved with a line Evelyn once wrote, "The final key doesn't open a door, it opens the truth." She hung it in the main corridor above a carved stone bench where children often sat waiting for class or counseling. Around the key, the walls had been painted with words in dozens of languages. Home, family, healing, courage. That evening, after the hall emptied, and the laughter of the day settled into memory, Ivy walked the grounds alone. She found herself back in the greenhouse, restored, now filled with orchids and violets. The same air her mother once breathed, the same soil her grandmother once turned with delicate fingers. Mason joined her after a while, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You keep coming back here," he said quietly. "It's where everything was buried," Ivy replied, "including us." He handed her a mug. Not anymore. A breeze moved through the glass panes. The leaves rustled, but it wasn't unsettling. It was alive. Ivy looked at the far corner where once the hatch to the underground chamber had sat hidden. She had sealed it weeks ago, not to erase what happened, but to make peace with it. The stone covering it bore a single etching, "Truth has roots, let them grow." That night, as dawn approached, Ivy stepped out onto the veranda. The sky over the estate was pale gold. The manor stood tall behind her, not a relic of old money and hidden sins, but now a monument to transformation. Children stirred in their new rooms, windows lighting up like lanterns. In one of the rooms, Lila, curled up with a book, held a flashlight like a sword. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. Mason passed behind Ivy on his way to prep for the weekend art class. He stopped just long enough to squeeze her shoulder. "You ever think we'd get here?" he asked. "No," she said, smiling, "but I think Evelyn did." He walked off, and Ivy remained on the porch watching the sunlight crawl across the lawn. It touched the branches, the rooftops, the narrow gravel paths that used to feel so haunted. Now they felt holy. And as the morning stretched itself across the land, Ivy whispered one final line, part prayer, part promise. This house lied once, now it tells the truth. And in the silence that followed, the wind carried that truth forward through every hallway, every drawing, every small hand reaching for something better. The manor no longer belonged to secrets. It belonged to them.